Hey everyone, Sally here. The episode you're about to hear is a deep dive into a story about a covert government plan that is also featured on Secrets Declassified, a new History Channel TV series hosted by David Duchovny. Secrets Declassified investigates explosive evidence from newly declassified files that shine a light on what the government does in secret. Check out new episodes on the History Channel every Friday or stream the next day on history.com. History This Week, April 27th, 1951. I'm Sally Helm. A negotiation has been going on for weeks. On one side, the United States. On the other, a small European kingdom, Denmark. Its population is around 4.5 million, a little less than the size of Massachusetts at the time. The two powers are far from evenly matched. But Denmark has something that the U.S. really wants. They've tried to get it before.
There was an offer from the U.S. to buy Greenland from Denmark. $100 million in gold.
Yes, the United States once tried to buy Greenland with gold. That is Christian Nielsen, an associate professor of science history at Aarhus University in Denmark. He said that bag of gold offer came soon after World War II.
And here I quote the Danish foreign minister at the time, "We know we owe a lot to the Americans, but we don't owe the entire island of Greenland."
To step back for a moment, in 1951, Greenland is a Danish colony. But the U.S. has had a foothold there since 1941. When they signed something called the Defense of Greenland Agreement, because Germany had just occupied Denmark, and the U.S. wanted to protect this giant icy island in the Arctic, make sure it didn't fall under Nazi control.
And I think a lot of people in the United States might easily forget about or don't know so much about Greenland, but it's very important.
That's partly about natural resources. Like during World War II, the U.S. had access to Greenland's deposits of the mineral cryolite, which was important for making airplanes. They also put weather stations on the island. That helped them forecast conditions in Europe, important for the war effort. But a lot of Greenland's strategic importance comes down to location. And by 1951, that is really the key reason that the U.S. wants to stay in Greenland. It's in the Arctic, right between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So it has military importance to both countries. It's the perfect place for radar stations, a place for nuclear bombers to refuel, and maybe even a place that could be used to launch nuclear missiles. The U.S. wants to control it before the Soviets do. So, on April 27, 1951, they reach a deal with Denmark to extend that previous Defense of Greenland agreement and let the U.S. operate military bases on the island, amass troops, machinery, and weapons. But Greenland will still be formally controlled by Denmark. The two nations sign on the dotted line at a ceremony in Copenhagen.
The 1951 agreement is very significant, and it's still standing as of today.
And Greenland, even with the Cold War over, it's still really significant too. Today, the United States tries to get its hands on Greenland. Once the Americans move in, how does their Arctic outpost connect to a massive nuclear secret? And why do they abandon a city beneath the ice? Greenland is a massive northern island, the largest island that isn't a continent. It's not that green, more frozen.
There's the big inland ice that covers nearly most of Greenland. It's only the outermost areas that are free of ice, and of course this is where people live.
People have been living in Greenland for a long time. Inuit people came to the island from North America around 4,500 years ago, and roughly 90% of Greenlanders today are Inuit. The Vikings also settled in Greenland starting around the year 982. In fact, they gave it that name. It was greener then. They built agricultural towns deep inland. And then the land started to freeze, part of something called the Little Ice Age. The ancestors of Greenland's indigenous population, the Thule, they survived, living on the western coast where they could hunt seals and caribou. A couple hundred years later, the Danes arrived, searching for lost Viking settlements and hoping to spread Christianity. They've had control over the island in one way or another since the mid-1700s. By the 1800s, the United States is looking to expand north, to get resources and extend their territorial power, and also because the general vibe is manifest destiny, that the U.S. has basically been ordained by God to spread across North America. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward purchases Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. He dreams of controlling Canada, too. And you know what's close to Canada?
There were speculations when the United States bought Alaska from the Russian Empire that Greenland would be a nice sort of purchase.
Seward commissions a report on Greenland and also Iceland. It notes Greenland's excellent coal and fisheries, along with vast quantities of foxes, wolf, reindeer, bear, hare, king duck, eider duck, doorskin, petrel. The list truly does go on. The writer concludes, we should purchase Iceland and Greenland, but especially the latter. It doesn't happen. Congress balks at Seward's expansionary plans, and he never makes an offer on Greenland. There's another attempt in 1910 to make this complicated trade involving the Philippines. That also doesn't happen. But when World War II breaks out, the U.S. again has its eye on Greenland. They want a base of operations in the North Atlantic, somewhere to build airfields and install radar and weather stations to help fight the Nazis. But Denmark still owns Greenland, and the Danish government has fallen under Nazi control. They're not going to agree to let the U.S. set up military bases there. Until the Danish ambassador to the U.S., Henrik Kaufmann, decides to take matters into his own hands.
He sort of declared himself an independent representative of Denmark because he said, the Danish government was collaborating with the Germans. We cannot consider that an independent and free nation, right? They're doing this under severe military pressure.
Henrik Kaufmann follows his own conscience and hopes the King of Denmark will forgive him later. In April of 1941, he signs an agreement giving the U.S. access to Greenland.
They agreed that it was better to be under American protection than fearing to be invaded by Nazi Germany.
And so, the U.S. moves in to this important strategic spot. Germany knows how important Greenland is. In fact, while the U.S. is building up its bases on Greenland's west coast, the Nazis sneak in on the other side of the island and build some secret bases. Until
war's dramatic action reaches the far north as Coast Guardsmen blast their way through ice floes off Greenland in an attempt to break up establishment of Nazi bases.
The Allies eventually discover those bases. By 1944, the Nazis are driven out of Greenland entirely.
Hidden in icy caves, much scientific equipment was captured, along with the crew of the Nazi weather station.
Weather plays a huge role in World War II. The stations on Greenland help time the successful D-Day invasion. And after World War II is over, the U.S. decides they want to stay in Greenland. With the Soviet Union rising as a rival superpower, that Arctic location is more important than ever. So, the U.S. starts working on a long-term plan. We heard about it from Paul Bierman, an environmental sciences professor at the University of Vermont.
They recruited probably the most pivotal scientist, a Swiss geologist named Henri Bader.
Henri Bader was an expert on snow and ice and permafrost and winter terrain. He'd worked on those topics in Switzerland in the 1930s, where he apparently cared more about skiing than studying. Who can blame him? He did love geology. He and his wife spent their honeymoon prospecting for minerals in Argentina. And after the war, in 1945, he settles in as a professor at Rutgers University. And then the U.S. government comes knocking. They're looking for someone who knows a lot about snow.
And then quickly recruited by the military to go to Europe and to speak to as many people as he could about the state of glaciology, the understanding of ice in Europe.
Bader becomes an official Army contractor.
He was designing all of these research programs for understanding the basic physics of snow and ice, not because the government cared about the basic physics of snow and ice, but because they cared about trafficability and how tracked and wheeled vehicles would work on the ice and whether you could build camps and all those sorts of things.
And you know where there's a lot of snow and ice? Greenland. The government is preparing to dig in, build a permanent base on this Arctic island. There's only one problem. Denmark won't sell. They turn down the offer of a big bag of gold, and eventually they take to the negotiating table. Denmark gets certain concessions. They retain control of Greenland, which boosts their standing in the newly formed NATO alliance. And in 1951, the Americans and the Danes sign that agreement in Copenhagen, the one that is still in effect today. It gives the US permission to build in so-called defense areas, but it doesn't say what those areas are or what defense really means. And the US seems to have a big project in mind.
When you look at the photographs, it's landing crafts. It looks like an invasion. You know, the front goes down and the bulldozers drive off and the men come in. They recruited, I think, 3,000 construction laborers, many of whom were recruited from Minnesota.
Minnesota, because it's cold. Many of these construction workers actually don't know where they're headed until they've already left the US on a ship. They just know that it's far away and the pay is good. They work all summer, sometimes through 24 hours of daylight, putting together a massive new military installation, Thule Air Base. The US hopes this will give them an edge in the Cold War. But Denmark will end up in the line of fire. Soon after Thule Air Base opens, there's a change in US military policy. A new theory, deterrence. Nuclear deterrence. America wants to build up a nuclear stockpile so large and be able to strike so quick that no one would dare attack them with atomic weapons. But they have a few problems to solve.
So at the time in the early 50s, nuclear bombers were not able to fly from the US to the Soviet Union and back again.
Christian Nielsen.
So they needed some kind of refueling, a station on the way, so to speak, and this was Thule Air Base.
Denmark is right in the middle of these two feuding superpowers, geographically, and now with Greenland, also politically.
In the late 1950s, the Soviet premier sent an open letter to Denmark warning Denmark that if we allowed the US military too much leeway in Greenland, for example with nuclear bases, then that would be the same as a kind of a suicide pact.
This warning comes from a 1957 letter from Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Bulganin. He says that if Denmark allowed the US to place nuclear weapons in Greenland, it would, quote, be synonymous with suicide.
So a very direct threat that, if there's any nuclear war, then Denmark will be a first target for the Soviet Union because of this collaboration with the Americans.
This sets off a delicate diplomatic dance. Later in 1957, the US reaches out to Denmark.
The US approached Denmark asking if they would mind at all that munitions of a special kind were being installed at Thule Air Base.
Munitions of a special kind, meaning nuclear weapons. They're careful not to put that in writing, even in a secret letter. You never know what might get leaked.
The Danish government said, well, you didn't give us any specific plans, so if you're not saying more about this, then we would not like to hear more.
The reply from the Danish Secretary of State about these munitions of a special kind was classified until 1995. It concludes, I do not think your remarks give rise to any comments from my side.
On the one hand, they allowed the US to have nuclear weapons on Thule Air Base in Greenland, But on the other side, they went out in public and said the Danish policy is not to have nuclear weapons in Denmark in peacetime. Only a very few people in Denmark at the time knew that there was this playing both sides strategy.
Starting in 1958, nuclear bombers routinely move in and out of Thule Air Base. They're part of the Airborne Alert Strategy, which said that there would be nuclear bombs in the air at all times in case a retaliatory strike was necessary. So the US has Thule, a military base near Greenland's coast. But they're also looking to expand inland. They've chosen a spot 138 miles from the coast. The land there is basically a sheet of ice. Winter temperatures hover around -50 degrees. They tell the Danes, we're going to build a huge complex beneath the ice. They call it Camp Century.
This really puzzled the Danish politicians, what was the real purpose of Camp Century? Why would they even think about investing so heavily in such a construction under the ice?
The stated purpose is research. And part of that research is just, can we do this? Build a base underground in the Arctic and have human beings inside it. Again, Paul Bierman.
Camp Century was this incredibly ambitious plan to have 200 men inside the ice, a main street tunnel that was 1,000 feet long.
For this project, the Army brings back the Swiss snow expert, Henri Bader.
Bader brought his expertise from Switzerland with him, brought the plows that are used to clear passes in the Swiss Alps to dig these trenches.
This snow milling machine, the Peter plow, was our pride and joy. Manufactured in Switzerland, it could handle up to 1,200 cubic yards of snow an hour.
The Army actually releases a documentary bragging about this ambitious project.
The basic concept was simple. A system of 23 trenches would be dug into the ice cap and then covered with steel arches and snow. Branching off the main communication...
The whole thing is powered by an experimental technology, a portable nuclear reactor. That's keeping the lights on and providing hot showers for the soldiers at Camp Century. We spoke to one of those soldiers. Dr. Robert Weiss was 26 years old when he learned where he'd be going as a new Army recruit. He walked into a colonel's office.
And everything he said, I said, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, sir. And then he said to me, in 1 week, you'll be getting on a plane and you're going to northern Greenland. And I looked at him, I said, you're kidding. I had lost this, yes, sir, no, sir.
Weiss was a doctor, and he'd asked for a research assignment. He got it. He flew to Greenland and made it to Camp Century.
You could see a couple of buildings, small huts that they had built on the outside. But there was essentially nothing. The wind was blowing. It was at least -50 degrees on the outside. I was very happy when I got into the tunnel.
Overall, Weiss says, it was actually a pretty chill assignment for an Army doctor.
I mean, I was always available, but remember, it's a young group of soldiers, so that the number that got sick was very small. There was injuries, but there weren't a lot of them.
Their quarters are modern, spacious, comfortable, and are not lacking in any detail.
Food was outstanding. I mean, I think that they calculate 8,000 calories per day per man, which is a huge amount of food.
Except for the fact that they have no windows, the men of Camp Century live exactly as do other soldiers.
You could almost forget that you were living under the ice. The scientists at Camp Century, they are doing some pretty wild experiments, working on cloud seeding machines that could literally control the weather.
They were launching silver iodide crystals on rockets to try to do this.
They're also drilling deep into the ice sheet. This is Henri Bader's big project. He convinces the government to look into this new question that's just come up. Why does Greenland, and actually the whole world, seem to be getting warmer?
This is just at the birth of understanding of climate change caused by humans. The first scientists starting to come out saying, if we're burning all this carbon dioxide, we could change the temperature of the Earth. And Bader argued quite cogently that what they needed to do was core the ice sheet to figure out the climate of the past, to understand whether these 5-10 years of warmth were something that had cycled through in the past or whether this was unusual.
Core the ice sheet. You drill down and bring up a cylinder of ice.
The Camp Century, the ice at the bottom of that core goes back over 100,000 years. And in that ice is encoded the history of climate.
You can see remnants of volcanic eruptions, little bits of ash.
There's some fantastic studies looking at the levels of lead in ice cores, and that can be mapped to when the Romans were smelting lead. There's some people who speculate you can see the plague or crises in the Roman Empire that turned down the lead smelting. All that preserved in ice.
The scientists at Camp Century are doing real work. But there is a whole other purpose to this city beneath the ice.
It was very important also that it was hidden. All right, it was hidden from you when you fly over. You can hardly see them. So it was concealed, and it was seen as a way in which you can have these large structures under the ice that could perhaps conceal nuclear weapons.
That is the secret vision for Camp Century. Nuclear warheads under the ice. Looking back on his time at Camp Century, Dr. Robert Weiss remembers one project that people seem to talk about a lot.
I was very much aware that they wanted to build a subway system.
A subway system. So they needed a lot of tunnels.
In retrospect, knowing what Iceworm is and what was planned, I was being told it, but I didn't know it.
Project Iceworm. Paul Bierman.
The Army proposed this kind of fantastical idea that if they had short to medium range nuclear missiles, they could hide them in the ice sheet. And they would hide them in an area about the size of the state of Alabama, to put some scale to it, that would have 600 missiles and tunnels crisscrossing it with rails and locomotives that would have moved these missiles back and forth like a giant shell game. There would be launch stations that the missile could pop up and be launched toward the Soviet Union.
The idea was that it would be really hard for the Soviet Union to take out all these missiles. Not only were they hidden underground, far away in the Arctic, but they were also in this massive area, the size of the state of Alabama, and constantly being moved. So if you wanted to get them all, you'd kind of have to bomb the whole thing, which would be tough. Although, it also turned out to be pretty tough to bring this fantastical idea, Project Iceworm, into reality. There were signs that this city under the ice wasn't totally stable structurally.
They spent a huge amount of time scraping the ice from the roofs.
On average, maybe a foot a year the walls were coming in, but in warm places, because snow and ice flow a lot better when they're a little warmer, near the dining hall, near the nuclear reactor, they were closing at several feet a year, which meant that they were constantly trimming the walls and getting the snow out of there.
The ice was much more fluid or dynamic than they originally thought. So these tunnels quite quickly became unstable.
Dr. Weiss remembers that the subway tunnel project seemed to run into some problems.
My recollection was they did this for a couple of days and then had an early storm and blew the tunnel in.
In actuality, that project got as far as a 1,300-foot length of track at Camp Century.
It didn't get very far, and I knew that it failed.
Based on these experiments, Project Iceworm is rejected. The Army scraps it. And over the course of the 1960s, they dismantle Camp Century as the frozen walls start to close in. By 1967, it's abandoned. Camp Century becomes an icy ghost town.
They left most of the buildings and machinery and diesel and chemicals there.
All the extra food, everything was left behind. They didn't take any of it out.
And all of this stuff has been sinking further and further into Greenland's ice sheet. Camp Century is now about 100 feet below the surface. There are buildings, fuel, antifreeze, food. Also, this is gross, all the human waste.
When you put 200 men flushing toilets and taking showers, that's a lot of warm water. And that simply melted its way into the ice and created a giant cavern. All that sewage, millions of gallons, is still there today. Frozen, but still there.
Frozen for now. But climate change, which was just starting to come into focus back in the 50s, has only gotten worse. And eventually, that Greenland ice sheet will melt enough to reveal this underground city.
The time will come, unless we get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that Camp Century will surface. And when it does, there's going to be, canned goods and steaks and latrines and chairs and girly magazines and all those things that were up there that are going to reappear.
It's not clear how long this will take. 100 years, 200 years, but it's coming. And as climate change melts the ice in Greenland, the island will only become more strategically important.
With the melting of Arctic ice and the warming temperatures, the Arctic will become more accessible. Nobody really knows how valuable the Arctic will become in the future.
Will the thawing Arctic ice open new shipping channels? Will new natural resources be revealed under Greenland's ice sheet? The island has minerals that are especially important for our technological future.
Who knows, in 30 years, it may be a very different Arctic that we're looking at.
For now, Greenland is still part of Denmark. It's more autonomous than it was back in the Camp Century days. It has its own parliament and legal system. But the United States still wants it. President Trump has made that goal very clear. He said he wants Greenland for strategic military reasons.
And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
But, as they have been saying for 150 years, Greenland and Denmark aren't interested.